Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumEtSpiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. This is another one in my series of Communio podcasts, wherein I interview, at the request of the editorial board of Communio, of which I am a member, I interview one or two authors from each issue of Communio. And this time around, this is the first author I'm going to be interviewing. It's from the latest edition of Communio. On the theme is education, and it is the summer 2025 issue. Before I talk about that, I don't want to be remiss here and rude. I'm going to introduce and thank my guest, Dr. Lawrence Goodall, or Larry, as he prefers to be called, which I love. All right, that's fantastic. Two Larrys. And so, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
I saw when William Hammett down at Communio sent me the list on a PDF file of all the various authors and their emails. Uh, your article immediately jumped out at me because number one, the topic interests me, which is the human knowledge of Jesus, but also because you talk about Hans Urs von Balthasar, who is very near and dear to my heart. So the title of your article is Quisnam Conveniencia, the Education of Jesus and St. Thomas Aquinas and Hans Urs von Balthasar. So for those who are watching on YouTube, I'll hold up the issue of Communio, and then on the back, you will see the article listed there. So we're talking about, in a sense, the human knowledge of Jesus. So, but before we begin that, please tell the listeners, the viewers, who you are. Where are you originally from? I know you live in near Miami now, and teach at a prep school, I believe. But maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about just who is Larry Goodall.
Sure. Well, I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, because my
Wow.
dad was career Army and was stationed there when I happened. Um, but I grew up in Miami Springs, Florida, where my maternal grandparents were founding citizens of the city back in the 20s. So grew up here. Um, Undergrad, I went to Georgetown. Then I got my master's in theology at Catholic University, where I was part of the first big group of lay students getting MAs in theology. At Catholic, about half of my classmates were lay people, half were seminarians. Uh, we were told that we were the first group to be that large. Uh, After finishing my MA, I came back home where I've been a teacher ever since. For 6 years, I taught in a Catholic elementary school in East Hialeah, St. John the Apostle. Then I taught for 13 years in an archdiocesan high school, Archbishop Curley Notre Dame. And then for the last 12 years, I've very happily been teaching at Belen Jesuit Preparatory, an all-boys Jesuit 6 through 12 prep school. Um, when I was still at St. John's, I started going to school at night at Barry University and completed my doctorate, Doctor of Ministry, while I was at Curley. Um,
Ver-
well, that's basically where I've been and what I've done.
where you've been and what you've done. All right. Yeah, you got your demon at Barry. I looked up the prep school you teach at. It's quite a large campus for a prep school, it seems to me.
Well, yeah, and it's got a very interesting history. Sometimes we say it's been in two cities in three countries because it was founded in Havana by the Queen of Spain when Cuba was still
Wow.
a Spanish colony. Um, then remained in Havana in the newly independent Cuba. But then when the Communist Revolution happened, the Jesuit community was expelled from Cuba and only missing one graduation ceremony. They reformed the school here in Miami. And then here in Miami, it's been in three different campuses. The present um, facility, it's been on this property since the early 80s.
Well, that's very, very interesting. It seems like a fantastic place. And I actually I often tell people who have PhDs and they automatically start thinking college. I want to teach university. Don't negate the prep school route. I taught for 4 years while I was working on my dissertation at Stewart Country Day School of the Sacred Heart, which is a Sacred Heart school, prep school, all girls, opposite of you, all girls, in Princeton, New Jersey, 1990 to 1994. And when I got my job at DeSales University in 94, it was actually a hard decision for me to make to go to DeSales and to leave Stewart Country Day School behind because I loved teaching the prep school kids there in Princeton. It was just a fantastic experience. Is your prep school a boarding school too?
No.
Yeah. Okay. It's a day school, as we called it in Princeton. It's a day school. They always want to make that distinction. Okay. Now we know a little bit about who you are. Let's get into your article, which is absolutely fascinating. I hope everybody rushes out to read it. I don't know if it's one of the ones I should check, uh, where if you go to the Communio webpage where it's linked as a PDF that you can download. I don't, sometimes they do that. I don't know if yours is one this time. I'll have to look. If it is, I'll link it. But anyway, you begin your article. It's on the human knowledge of Jesus. We'll start there by quoting the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 52, the famous verse where Luke says, Jesus grew in age and in wisdom and in the favor of God, which from time immemorial, it seems, has elicited all kinds of reflection from the patristic era on forward as to what it could possibly mean that the incarnate Son of God, okay, acquires knowledge, that he grows in wisdom. So you sort of then begin with a discussion of what Aquinas said about this. So I don't know how you want to begin. If you want to begin with a little riff on Luke 2:52, or if you want to just immediately move into what Aquinas thought about the acquired knowledge of Jesus, or the different levels of knowledge in Christ.
Well, sure. I mean, I think scripture is always the right place to start. So, when the gospel according to Luke says of Jesus in his childhood that he grew, uh, well, that statement has to be true, because it's in
Yes,
divine revelation. Uh, but then the enduring challenge is, given the mystery of the hypostatic union, uh, when it says that Jesus grew in knowledge, that statement has to be authentic to be true to the fullness of Jesus's humanity. At the same time, the fullness of Jesus's divinity means that at one and the same time, Jesus is omniscient. Well, how do you talk about the Lord and be faithful to both of those? I mean, that is the enduring challenge for Christology, to be faithful to the fullness of the Lord's divinity and the fullness of his humanity. Uh, and I think, historically, the constant temptation is for people to emphasize one at the expense of the other.
right,
Uh, so now I think the way St. Thomas addresses this is I think very wisely, uh, when you look at the question, Jesus knew, if you have a sentence where Jesus is the subject and the predicate is he knows, well, then the question St. Thomas would ask is how? How does he know? In other words, that there are different modes of knowledge. Okay? And he makes the distinction between three basic modes.
right.
There's his divine knowledge, that is what he knows in his human nature. I'm sorry, in his divine nature, I beg your pardon.
So he has the beatific vision.
Well, actually, the beatific vision would be something St. Thomas says he experiences in his human nature. So
Oh,
his divine,
exactly. So he's got divine knowledge, and then there's the beatific vision of his human nature. Yes, exactly.
correct. So when I said three distinctions, that's three distinctions within the human. So I should have been more clear. So when he knows as God, So when he knows in his divine nature, that knowledge can only be omniscient because he's God. Uh, but when he knows as a human being, and this is the great mystery, he is one person, so he's the subject of the act of knowing. But those modalities of knowledge, when he knows as God and he knows as a human being, he's the one doing the knowing. But those modalities remain distinct, since as the Council of Chalcedon teaches, his natures remain distinct from one another, that they're not confused, they're not blended. Uh,
Yeah.
so that would mean that their activities each have their own proper integrity. So when his knowledge as a human being has to have its own integrity, so that therefore his human knowledge has to be, as the Catechism says, finite. So it's this great mystery that as God, he is omniscient, but as a man, his knowledge is finite, and he's the one knowing at one and the same time. It's not like a switch is flipping and sometimes he's knowing as God and sometimes he's knowing as a human being. He's one person always doing the knowing, uh, but he's always knowing through both of these modalities at one and the same time, and each of them has its own integrity that has to be respected. Uh, so St. Thomas first says that when Luke says of Christ that he grew in wisdom, that has to apply to his human knowledge, not to his divine knowledge. His divine knowledge, being infinite, cannot grow. But then St. Thomas makes three more distinctions. When he looks at his human knowledge, it knows how does the Lord know as a human being? He makes three distinctions. The first is what he calls his beatific knowledge. So St. Thomas holds that Jesus, throughout his earthly life, experiences in his humanity the beatific vision. That is, his human awareness uh, knows the divine essence in the manner that the blessed in heaven experience. Uh, and Thomas holds that is incapable of growth because for Thomas, that's basically kind of all or not, either you have it or you don't mode of knowledge. There's his infused knowledge or charismatic knowledge. Uh, that is what would be in some ways similar to the grace of prophecy, or the gift of infused knowledge among the charismatic gifts. And St. Thomas holds that Jesus has that in its fullness at every moment of his human life, and that therefore that is incapable of growth. And then there's what St. Thomas calls acquired knowledge,
Right.
okay? Uh, Knowledge which he gains for himself. And St. Thomas holds that the statement Jesus grew in knowledge applies to that and only that mode of knowledge, acquired knowledge. Uh, Now, in that, he's already in the Summa changing his mind from what he'd held in some of his earlier writings. In some of his earlier writings, uh, he echoes what had been the medieval consensus prior to him, that Jesus's knowledge is complete at every stage of his earthly life. And Nicholas Healy has an article where he points out that when you look at all of the gospel passages uh, that are similar to this one, that refer to Jesus growing in knowledge, or when Jesus expresses ignorance, like when the woman in the crowd who has the hemorrhage touches him
Yeah.
and he
Who
says,
touched me?
"Okay." uh, Nicholas Healy points out that before the Arian controversy, the patristic figures before the Arian controversy, such as Origen or St. Irenaeus, they have no qualms reading those passages at their face value. That when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" he's asking a real question and he doesn't know the answer. Or when it says Jesus grew, that isn't problematic for them. The problem is that when the Arian controversy happens and the Arians basically weaponize those passages, trying to claim them as evidence that Jesus is not fully divine, after the First Council of Nicaea, then the fathers and the early medievals become very hesitant to admit that Jesus ever experienced any mode of ignorance at all, because that sounds like an infringement on the fullness of his divinity. Uh, Now, St. Thomas eventually comes to accept that Jesus's acquired knowledge can grow uh, because of the integrity of his humanity. As he says, nature does nothing in vain. Uh, so since the human person has the capacity to obtain new knowledge, uh, because Jesus is fully human, that capacity must have the opportunity to exercise itself, that capacity must have the opportunity to realize itself, or else nature would be acting in vain. So St. Thomas comes in the Summa to accept that Jesus's acquired human knowledge does grow. Now, within that, then he makes another set of distinctions. St. Thomas loves to make
Well, and this is where the rubber hits the road. This is the interesting part.
right. Well, you could view this as another set of distinctions or as a related pair of distinctions.
Yes.
He doesn't ask the questions in the same place, but they to me seem to be two different ways of naming the same thing. He asks whether he learned from things and whether he learned from people. Okay. In another place, he asks whether he learned by experience or whether he learned by being taught. Now, he asks these in distinct places, although to me, they seem to be logically parallel. Uh, Learning from things, meaning his own immediate experience, his sense experience, uh, you know, in his humanity as he travels, goes places he's never been, sees things he's never seen. Uh, I mean, he doesn't give this example, but say he ate a food for the first time. These would all be new experiences. Uh, and Thomas holds that Jesus does learn from experience, learn from things, that he gains new knowledge in his sense experience. However, when the question is put, does he learn from other human beings? In other words, does he learn through being taught, through any human being instructing him? St. Thomas holds that no, he does not. And his argument is, well, Jesus is given to us as the teacher, and a teacher teaches, a teacher is not taught. Therefore, Jesus cannot be taught by other human beings. Uh, so he narrows, when he says that Jesus's acquired human knowledge does grow, he narrows that to knowledge from experience of things. He excludes the notion of Jesus learning anything from other human beings. Now, the strongest counterexample to that would be, again, in the Gospel according to Luke, uh, when Our Lady and Saint Joseph bring the child Jesus to Jerusalem for the Passover, and Jesus stays behind, and Our Lady and Saint Joseph spend 3 very anxious days searching for him, and they find him in the temple in the midst of the scholars and the elders, and it says that he was asking them questions. Now, the immediate interpretation of, okay, a little boy is asking professional teachers questions. I'd say the most immediate interpretation of that is he has real questions and he's looking for answers. But St. Thomas quotes Origen's interpretation of that, which basically turns Jesus asking
Mhm.
questions into a kind of Socratic questioning that
Exactly.
not
Yeah.
really asking questions. He's more using the mode of a question in order to teach. Okay. Um, Now, the what prompted my article is that St. Thomas's position on this question, that Jesus had no human teachers, he did not learn from human beings, to me has a very clear and very troubling implication, which St. Thomas does not draw this implication himself. He doesn't seem to consider the implication. Uh, But if Jesus had no human teachers, if no human being ever taught Jesus anything, then that would necessitate that Our Lady never taught Jesus anything, that Saint Joseph never taught Jesus anything. Now, again, to be very clear, Saint Thomas does not consider the implication of his position for the Holy Family, uh, but it what prompted my article is uh, I think that the implications of that position for the Lord's relationship with the Blessed Mother and with Saint Joseph are very troubling and ultimately not acceptable. Uh, that if Our Lady never taught Jesus anything, well, then how is she truly his mother? Because it is the classic teaching of the church, going back, to the Council of Ephesus, that Our Lady is the Theotokos. She is the mother of God, that she is truly his mother. Uh, and mother is a person-to-person relationship.
Yeah, it's not just a biological reality. There's a full-orbed relational experience that goes with being a mother.
Right. So that if she, in other words, as St. John Paul II says in Mulieris Dignitatem, there is an educative dimension to motherhood. There is a formational dimension to motherhood. Uh, and if that were not present in Our Lady's relationship to Jesus, then her maternity would be diminished. That she would simply be his mother in a physical sense. And, yes, she would have, fed him, but the whole educative dimension of motherhood would be lost. Um, and that would be ultimately a diminishment of Christ's full humanity. That part
Yes.
of being human is that experience.
Yes, let's back up a second and go back to Aquinas, if you don't mind, and then we'll swing back to the Holy Family in a second. But you point out in the article that one of the reasons that Aquinas gives for saying that Jesus was never taught anything by another human being is the reason of conveniencia, that it's simply more fitting that Jesus was a teacher and not a student of anything. And it's therefore sort of unbecoming of the Son of God, even in his humanity, to be taught anything at all. And then later on in the article, you go on a little excursus of Aquinas asking the question of whether or not angels can learn from one another. And so the point that you make, it seems to me, is that Aquinas leaning on the argument of fittingness uh, raises the question of what kind of fittingness are we talking about? In other words, sometimes we can say that something is fitting simply because it meets our philosophical biases, our cultural prejudices. And so are we not dealing here in Aquinas with a kind of uh, Platonism, a kind of residual Platonism? Uh, well, anyway, I'll let you comment on that.
Well, yes, because another thing which then prompted my article is uh, if if St. Thomas's argument about Christ's human knowledge in terms of learning from people leads to a conclusion that is unacceptable, and I hold that it does, well, then there must be something wrong with the argument he used to get there. And his argument is, as you said, an argument from fittingness or propriety, an argument from conveniencia. And that led me to try to analyze not just the specific argument he gives, which in this case is really quite brief, simply, well, it is not fitting that a teacher be taught, but rather a teacher teaches. Um, I thought that that's a pretty brief uh, argument to use for something that has such massive implications. So I wanted to then look at that more closely. And how does that mode of argument function? How does that mode of argument work? In other words, fitting or appropriate according to what standard? Which, of course, is a very modern question to ask. when you make the judgment something is fitting or not, okay, what are the criteria that are being used to assess that? What is the framework that is informing that judgment? Um, and that led me to propose uh, a kind of taxonomy for arguments from fittingness. Um, that when I mean, probably the most famous argument from conveniencia is St. Anselm's
Right.
argument in Cur Deus Homo, where he's responding to classic Jewish and Muslim objections to the incarnation, that it would be inappropriate for God to lower himself to be human, and it would be inappropriate for God, who is almighty and the judge of all, to submit himself to human violence in the Passion. Uh, and St. Anselm therefore goes on to argue why it is fitting. Now, what occurred to me is in that argument, the conclusion, uh, God did it, is given in divine revelation, right? In other words, the incarnation is given in divine revelation. The passion of the Lord is given in divine revelation. And if God did it, well, then it's appropriate, right? So there, Anselm is taking a conclusion that is warranted by divine revelation itself. So it has the highest standard of trust, and therefore, all right, it is fitting. How is it fitting? You know, since God did it, it must be appropriate. How is it appropriate? Uh, I call that an explanatory argument from conveniencia. So
Right.
taking something which is given in divine revelation and looking for ways uh, to establish its propriety, which of course, now that might be very challenging, as of course, as it is in the case of the incarnation and the passion, but it's ultimately certain. Okay? Not the specific argument that Anselm gives, but the conclusion is certain because it's given in divine revelation. As opposed to when St. Thomas considers whether or not it's appropriate for, well, what I shouldn't say, he doesn't consider whether or not it's appropriate. He simply asserts it is not appropriate for
Right.
Christ to be taught. There, he's addressing a question which divine revelation doesn't answer, right? The question of how the modalities of Christ's human knowledge work, data for that is given in Scripture, but the actual question isn't raised in Scripture. Um,
Similarly, I don't mean to interrupt, with regard to the question of whether angels can learn from one another. That's not a question that Revelation asks or answers.
correct. So when you take a question whose conclusion isn't given in Scripture, and then you try to reach an answer using an argument from convenientia. I call that a provative argument from convenientia. And I hold that that kind of argument is always less secure than the explanatory mode, precisely because you're dealing with a question whose answer isn't given in Revelation, an answer that we derive for that based on convenientia can only have a lower level of confidence than the first
Yeah.
mode.
Yeah, and so that leads us to the sort of state, as you call it, the status questiones of the question today, because it's certain based on revelation that the boy, the man, Jesus, grew in some way in wisdom. Okay, so this is the datum of revelation that we have with which we have to deal, and we now, in terms of modern understanding of human subjectivity and the importance of historicity and the importance of historicity in our subjectivity and so forth, the sort of modernist crisis kind of kickstarts this whole question of just what does it mean that the human knowledge of Jesus grows in this way? But we are now much more sensitive to the fact that the human person is inherently relational. In other words, Aquinas seems to presume that if I'm ignorant of something, that represents a defect, and therefore that's a kind of kind of fault that Jesus just wouldn't have. And yet, I'm not certain that in our modern understanding of human subjectivity, that every form of ignorance that has to be, in a sense, remediated through teaching or being taught is a defect, that it's actually a sort of positive aspect of our nature that we are fulfilled in this relational way. You know, so as C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity, when Jesus asked the question, "Who touched me?" Lewis says, I would like to think that he really wanted to know. And so this is kind of the point that Lewis is making as well. Am I wrong about that?
I agree with you completely. Which is why, well, I mean, a couple of points. I mean, there's a lot of patristic and medieval glosses on that passage. When the woman with the hemorrhage touches Jesus and he says, "Who
Yeah.
touched me?" That uh, end up basically evacuating the passage of its real meaning. That, oh, well, he just pretended that he didn't know because he didn't want to frighten people with his omniscience. Um, well, I mean, I ultimately I don't think that's acceptable. I mean that ends up having what some 20th century writers will say is an almost crypto-monophysite quality. Um, and I think it goes back to, as you said, the Platonic inheritance. And uh, I mean, and hey, I delight in Plato, and he's wonderful, but there are aspects of them that are highly problematic. And one would be, for Socrates all uh, all moral evil resides in ignorance, right? But then that means it flows both ways, that all ignorance is connected to some kind of moral defect. Um, Now, I think here's where I think Aquinas, when he changes his mind about Christ's acquired human knowledge on the principle that nature does nothing in vain, uh, I think he's totally correct on that. I think the problem is he didn't follow his own reasoning as
Right.
fully as he might have. That the capacity to be taught uh, is part of human relationality. It's not simply a defect, it's something intrinsic to the nature of, I mean, here I'm blurring language, but when I say the nature of human personhood,
Yeah.
um, but so, I mean, because he does interestingly when he talks about the angel uh, consider a very interesting case, which again, I think he stops too soon. Uh, he acknowledges the very real fact that there can be uh, a bishop who is both less learned, less wise, and less holy than a priest who is his subject. So that when that happens, you can have the priest teaching the bishop. Uh, but he says that's because of human sinfulness. That an individual bishop, because of his sin, could be of less learning or wisdom than a priest who is a subject. Well, I mean, that's experientially true, but I also think it's true that every human teacher, and I think that's where the rub is, Jesus as God, okay? Well, only God is teacher in the full unrestricted sense. God has nothing to learn. But Jesus, in his humanity, when he ministers as a teacher, yes, he's the second person of the Trinity who's teaching, but he's also a man who is teaching. Well, I mean, you were a university professor and before
Yeah.
that, prep school teacher. I've been a teacher for 32 years. Uh, I mean, I think it is the universal experience of anyone who's been a teacher for a while who pays attention to their experience that you learn things from your students. And not only because sometimes they are more virtuous than I, which is true, but sometimes because the Lord sometimes sends them into the classroom to teach me something.
Right.
That's just because of moral defect. And that beautiful line in the Rule of Saint Benedict, where Saint Benedict stipulates that on all great matters, the abbot has to summon a consultative chapter, and everyone has to be heard, beginning with the youngest. And he says, because sometimes it pleases the Lord to reveal the truth to the youngest. You know? Um, In other words, I didn't explore this in the article, but when St. Paul in First Corinthians explores the whole image of the church as the body of Christ and all the different parts of the body need one another so that not everyone receives the same gifts, um, that's also true in the matter of knowledge and insight. The Lord doesn't reveal uh, all the same aspects of the truth to all of us equally at the same time so that we can learn from one another. And that in itself is a positive good. That's the thing. I'm not sure St. Thomas in the Summa adequately recognizes that passive capacity, the capacity to learn from one another, as an intrinsic good sufficiently.
I agree. I mean, lurking in the background, of course, is Trinitarian theology, whether or not relationality is a transcendental property of being, and the relational communio, circumcision, perichoresis aspects of the Trinitarian persons within God. Implies that it's relationality turtles all the way down. That's kind of what we mean when we say God is love. And so I keep coming back to this. One of the things I loved about your article is that this notion that we learn through relationality is that it is not a defect in our personhood. It's deeply constitutive of not only who we are, but in a supereminent way. God doesn't have to learn anything, of course, but in a supereminent way, God is constituted by a series of relations. And so it seems like almost lurking in the background is this overly static concept of the Trinity among some of the medievals that's sort of playing at work here.
Well, yes, and I mean, I don't address this in the article, but I think an implication of what you just said would be, and I think appropriately, given that it was just this past weekend that the Holy Father issued the letter on the anniversary of Nicaea.
Nicaea,
Uh, I've always thought, when I teach the Council of Nicaea and I teach the Nicene Creed, one of the things I emphasize is, on the one hand, Arianism is a heresy about Jesus. It's a Christological heresy. It's denying the full divinity of
right,
Jesus. But there's another sense in which it's a heresy about God the Father, because for Arius, God the Father has not always been Father, right? For Arius, God is simply a monad who then at a certain point in time acquires fatherhood. For an Arian, the divine paternity is an acquired trait as it is for a human father. Whereas what the Council of Nicaea says, what we say every time we say the Nicene Creed and we say of Jesus that he is eternally begotten of the Father, what you're saying is there is never a time when God the Father isn't Father, that he is
right,
eternally the Father of the
of the
Son.
Son. Yes,
That's who he is. That begetting the Son is what he does forever. Uh, so that his paternity is not an acquired trait, it's his name. When it says in Ephesians that every fatherhood on earth is named after the Father, um, that yes, that this relationality that we experience in our human identity, I would argue, is part of the image and likeness of God in us, reflective of the Trinity of persons. Now, again, I don't explore that in the article, but I think, yes, you're
yeah.
completely correct.
Well, yeah, I was cheering as the article went on because those truths of communio theology were dancing in my head just a bit. I want to back up a bit to the question of the fact that Jesus had to be taught certain things. That does imply, therefore, that Jesus, in his acquired human knowledge, that he was ignorant of some things and had to be taught. Now, with the modernist crisis and the rise of modern form critical, higher critical exegesis, the church was presented with a crisis because the proponents of higher critical exegesis, and then many in the modernist movement, made a big deal about the fact, well, Jesus, in other words, what we would call low Christology. Jesus was ignorant of many things. And so, kind of what is at stake here, as you point out, you go through 5 points. What is at stake here was, did Jesus, was he ignorant of the time of the second coming? I mean, was he expecting an imminent parousia? Did he have a consciousness of his divine identity in his human knowing? Was he aware of the salvific nature of his sacrifice on the cross? Uh, what of the beatific vision? And then, of course, did he in fact intend to found a church? I mean, we all know the famous statement, Christ preached the kingdom and we got the church instead, or how Jesus,
Glossy.
yeah, yeah, and so, as you point out, Cardinal Schönborn says, these are real serious soteriological issues, which is why, in certain church documents, Lamentabili, and then later on Pius XII, you see the church moving very strongly in favor of a very high Christology that says, Jesus did intend to found a church. He was aware. And so anyway, maybe you could comment on that.
Well, I would say that the modernists take uh, the evidence of Jesus experiencing ignorance and then generalize it and absolutize it so that, they end up saying, some version of Arianism all over again, or even lower than Arianism, some version of adoptionism, where he's just merely a human being,
Right.
was a great religious teacher. Um, Now, I think what happens in the magisterium's response to modernism, as it then gets qualified, across the 20th century, is the question of Christ's ignorance or knowledge has to get broken down into highly specific issues and highly specific questions. So, on the question of his self-awareness, that is, does he know who he is? Okay? There, the magisterium firmly, consistently says that Jesus always knows who he is. Now, I think that is distinct from the question of in his human consciousness, how is he going to articulate that? Now, in other words, I think one could say that uh, Jesus as an adult man, as opposed to Jesus as an adolescent, as opposed to Jesus as a little child, uh, are going to articulate that self-awareness in very different ways. I think you can say that and not be a modernist. I don't think it is modernist to say that the human expression of that would have grown in certain ways appropriate to Jesus's uh, stage of development as a human being. What's completely unacceptable would be the notion that Jesus, as a child and a boy and a young man, simply, well, thinks he's just an ordinary person, and then all of a sudden one day discovers his identity. That's completely out of bounds. That's completely unacceptable. Um, in other words, Jesus has to always, in some way, know who he is, okay? That he is the Father's son, okay? Um, so I mean, I think that is very clear. Uh, in terms of the salvific nature of his death, so I mean, what some of the 19th century historical critics, well, Jesus was trying to, have a political revolution or start a kingdom and then failed and was,
Yeah.
crushed. I mean, that's completely unacceptable. Uh, that Jesus has to know what he's doing and why he's doing it. So that, as St. Paul says in Galatians, he loved me and gave himself for me. For that statement to be true, Jesus has to know what he's doing and why he's
Yeah.
doing it. So his awareness of and intention of and free human acceptance of the salvific nature of his death has to be affirmed. And then his clear intent to found the church. In other words, Loisy's, infamous quote, as you just said, is if the church were some sort of accidental byproduct of the failure of Jesus's real mission, that's completely unacceptable. That the church is in continuity with Jesus, that is Jesus's will to found the church, that the church is his body, not simply in a metaphorical sense, but in a mysteriously real way. All of those have to be affirmed. Now, when you look at the question of the beatific vision, that's where it gets a little bit, well, nuanced. Um, Pius XII in Mystici Corporis affirms that Jesus experiences the beatific vision. Um, when you look at John Paul II in Novo Millennio Innuente, he avoids using the language of the beatific vision, and then whether or not the beatific vision is implied, you'll get scholars falling on both sides of that. Um, I think I think probably the best observation on the question of the beatific vision was probably made by your great teacher, Father Ed Oakes, in a lot of his articles and in his book on Christology. Um, it's
Infinity Dwindled to Infancy. Great
what
book.
a magnificent book. What a really
Yeah.
magnificent book. Um, I think the question is, what do we mean by the beatific vision? Uh, if you mean that Jesus in his humanity, and I think the phrase Father Oakes uses is always quote unquote blissed out, so that he's experiencing uninterrupted joy. Well, then, if that's so, then how is the reality of the passion genuine? I think that's really problematic. Um, also, I think Father Thomas Weinandi makes some interesting points about the beatific vision by its very nature uh, is a post-death
I
experience.
was just going to bring that. You quote Wine Andy talking about how we associate beatific vision with a post-mortem situation.
Right. So, you know, how would you, and as I think here we're at the boundary of a great mystery where we have to admit the limits of what we know and we don't know in the sense of Jesus is who he is at every moment. But on the other hand, there is a real difference between Jesus before the resurrection and Jesus after the resurrection. Jesus in the status exinationis and the state of glory. Now, how you interpret and explain that difference, I think we have to admit the limits of, again, what we know and what we don't know. He's the same person at all points. He's the second person of the Trinity and he's God. But there is a real difference. In other words, the ascension matters. The ascension, Jesus before the glorification of his humanity and Jesus afterwards, there is a significant difference. There's real continuity, but there's also real difference. And both of those need to be taken seriously. Um, so I mean, I think Father Oakes, if I remember correctly, he proposes that we just find another way of talking about it if the term beatific vision
Yeah.
uh, leads to obscurity. Uh, but of course, the interesting thing is when you look at all these 20th century debates and magisterial interventions on the questions of Christ's knowledge, the specific question, which is the subject of my article, did Jesus have human teachers, really doesn't show up. It's just not one of the central issues uh, of that. So
Yeah, and that comes out. I mean, you talk about Jacques Maritain approach, Jean Gallo, Wynandy, Ronner, Ed Oakes, Congar, Balthasar. Then you go into the Catechism, JP2, the International Theological Commission. None of them really address the issue of whether or not Jesus needed teachers. But to go back to, before we move on, to go back to the beatific vision question, one of the things that always strikes me, and I got this from Father Oakes while I was working on my dissertation one day over a couple of beers. We were talking about this, believe it or not, and I said to Ed, the problem it seems to me is that we talk about the beatific vision as if we actually know what it is. that we can define it. Okay, it's the immediate vision of the essence of God. But what does that mean? What is the modality in a human the human experience of that beatific vision? How does that show up? What is it like? And we don't know that. And that's why I like the point you pointed out, why Nandy says we normally associate this with a post-mortem situation simply because we don't have any experience in this life walking around of the beatific vision. Maybe tiny little rumors of angels or glimpses of a moment of enlightenment from God, but no beatific vision. And so we automatically assume that Jesus, we have to affirm that he had the beatific vision, but when we automatically assume that that means just some sort of that he was, like you said, quoting Ed, blissed out, that while he's sitting there eating fish with his apostles, he's also at the same time, seeing the entire universe and making sure Jupiter stays in its orbit and all this kind of stuff. I just think we have to take into account that there is a beatific vision there, but it's in the modality of a human consciousness, a divine human consciousness to be sure, but a human consciousness, the exact manner of which we don't understand.
Well, I think, um, and here's where I need to say this very carefully, lest I incur the wrath of some of your Thomistic friends. Um, I think when you look at some 19th and 20th century Thomist writers, not all, but some, I think there can be a way of talking about the beatific vision that is a little bit too casual, as if
Yes.
we knew what it meant, uh, a little bit too cut and dried and formulaic. Uh,
Yes.
in other words, I think we have to always be very conscious of, uh, I mean, just as when we speak of the hypostatic union, Jesus is one person in two natures, fully God and fully human. That is true, and it is true in an unqualified sense. At the same time, it is a great mystery,
Yeah.
and its mystery does not diminish its truth content, but its truth content is not the same in type as some purely finite truth that I can give the definition of something, okay, there, done and over, move on to the next deduction that follows from that. In other words, it never stops being mystery because it always exceeds our natural capacities. Um, which doesn't mean, therefore, just radical skepticism or we don't know anything. No, we know genuine truths that are revealed, but we have to always respect the wonder that comes from that. And again, I mean, and this is related, I think, very closely to the subject of the article. When the Catechism says that Jesus, in his humanity, in his human knowledge, knows what it is to experience wonder, okay? That's integral to his humanity. Well, wonder presupposes a certain kind of, I use the word nescience, lack of knowledge, because
Yeah.
while it points to the same thing as the term ignorance, it doesn't necessarily have the same connotations. Um, well, for Jesus in his humanity to experience wonder presupposes that he can be surprised, right?
Yes. Balthazar says that explicitly, that even within the Trinitarian relations, in a super eminent way, of course, befitting his infinity, that there is surprise even within God, that it doesn't imply a defect of any kind, that it's once again it's an aspect of the eternal relations of the Trinitarian persons.
Right. I mean, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit contemplating one another never get bored, right?
Yeah,
Like
right.
I mean, the Trinitarian persons, even as at the one and the same time they have perfect total knowledge, there's a certain mysterious sense in which they are perpetually astonished at one another.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what the point Balthazar is making. And by the way, you don't have to worry about about being somewhat critical of Thomas Aquinas on my podcast here. I mean, I love Aquinas. Balthasar loved Aquinas, but I do not consider him to be the be all and end all of doing theology. And you know, and I it's one of the things I appreciated actually about your article was that you were deeply respectful of Aquinas. You deal with him first, but at the same time, you point out that there's a defect there. It reminds me, too, of an article I read by my friend John Betts, who teaches at Notre Dame, where he criticizes Aquinas for saying that there can be no humility in God, that humility is not something that God has, because once again, conveniencia, it would not be fitting for God to be humble before anybody else, because, I mean, he's the dude. Right? He's the dude. Why? Who would he be humbled? But Betts lays out a very good case in this regard. So, yeah, I love Aquinas, but I do think also that, and I'll be careful here. We suffer, I think, in some ways theologically from a sort of hegemony of Thomistic thinking. At least we did at one time. You know, it's interesting too. It's way off topic, and I'm just going to throw this out there. One of the reasons why Pope Leo the 13th, you know, championed a revivification of Thomistic studies is precisely because, believe it or not, Thomas was not being studied or taught in most schools of theology or seminaries. Scholasticism was, but they had gotten far removed from Aquinas. And once the Thomistic revival happens, as Tracy Rowland points out in her book Catholic Theology, it spawned nothing less than 17 different schools of Thomistic thought. And so when we have to be very, very careful when we say, well, this is the Thomistic position. Well, you know, which version? Which version of Thomas?
Well, and I think when you read St. Thomas himself,
Right.
there is this remarkable breadth and generosity of thought. In other words, he read everybody who was available to him. Uh, I mean, the story about him that I think it was the King of France, Saint Louis, asked him if there was anything he wanted, and he said, "Oh, there's that volume of Chrysostom I would love to read." Well, I mean, when you read Thomas, I mean, he quotes everybody, pagan philosophers, Muslim commentators on Aristotle, Jewish commentators on Aristotle, every church father he has access to. I mean, there's this capaciousness
Yes.
to his thought, which I think when some, again, I'm being very carefully qualified, but some later 19th and 20th century iterations of Thomism kind of narrow that down and only consider Thomas's positions themselves without that same capaciousness and without that same broad engagement with the whole intellectual world that's going on.
Yeah.
I think that kind of capaciousness is at the heart of St. Thomas Aquinas. And if that isn't there, then I don't think St. Thomas is being followed faithfully, no matter whether or not his specific positions are being held.
Yeah. I could not agree more. And I think there is a need to have a more capacious understanding of the capacious Aquinas, if we want to put it that way. Uh, us move on because we've been at this almost an hour now. What is Balthasar's contribution to this conversation? I mean, I kind of have a sense of it since I wrote on Balthasar, but I'd like for you to articulate what you think Balthasar's contribution is here.
Well, von Balthasar, of course, for von Balthasar, Christ's awareness of identity is central to his Christology. So, I mean, he very strongly holds that Christ knows who he is and approaches the cross in full awareness of who he is and what he's doing and why. But he is very sensitive to the experience of human relationality
Right.
and in the way that knowledge expresses itself in Christ's sacred humanity. And he holds that it is intrinsic to human nature that human consciousness um, can only come to itself and develop through relation with another, preeminently in ordinary human experience, one's mother. And of course, he has, I mean, that famous passage where, he says that the first time a baby recognizes his or her mother smiling and smiles
Right.
back is in some ways the most pivotal moment in that human being's development. The awareness of being loved and the awareness of the gift of the love of another. Um, well, that would also be true for Christ's sacred humanity, so that his self-awareness, with all that that implies in its human expression and human development, that Our Lady plays a preeminent role in that,
Yeah.
that that her maternal relationship with him is in human terms, a constitutive aspect of Jesus's self-awareness as a human being, and therefore, in its human terms, a constitutive aspect of his messianic self-awareness, uh, so that she plays an irreplaceable role in his understanding of who he is. Um, so that Mariology is uh, a fundamental aspect of Christology. Um, so that Yes, I mean, I think he provides a way to take Christ's human relationality, his human growth in knowledge, very, very seriously without the danger of any of the modernist interpretations of that. I think he provides a path towards the full affirmation of the Lord's divinity and his humanity at one and the same time.
Wow. That is why to those listening who would be saying, well, why is this all important? Uh, it's important because from from the very first moment the church was born, there have been these two counter tendencies to either have a monophysite Christ or a simple adoptionist Christ, a very, very super high Christology that denigrates the humanity and eclipses the humanity, or a very, very low Christology that treats the divine aspect as well. Jesus was just maybe the most maxed out person in terms of grace. You kind of get that in some versions of Runarianism, that Jesus was just the most engraced, maxed out person's their God consciousness, whoever was. All right. And those are the two extremes that have to be avoided here. Revelation teaches us that Jesus knew who he was and knew what his mission was, and that he embraced the cross and its significance, and that he founded a church. And so Revelation teaches us. So in terms of fittingness, it would fit your explanatory category to now go on and say, uh, this though is why Jesus had to know what his mission was. Now, how did that happen? I mean, you see, we talked about the scene in the temple, where Jesus' parents were looking for him. I mean, what is he, 12 years old? And he says, did you not know that I would be, in my father's house? So his awareness of who he was and what his mission was comes to him at a very early time. Now, that must have been the result not just of having the beatific vision and infused knowledge and so on. It had to be the result of him being taught by his mother. Remember in Luke's gospel as well, it says after all this, the Annunciation, the Nativity, and all, Jesus and Mary pondered all these things in her heart. Well, I'm sure she taught those things to the boy Jesus as he was growing up as well. Hey, this is what happened when you were born, son. And I'd like to think that Jesus probably, as a boy, didn't know that until he was taught that by his mother.
Right. And I think also, I mean, looking at the role of Saint Joseph, I mean, Saint John Paul II in Redemptoris Custos teaches very clearly, yes, Saint Joseph saved Jesus's life when Herod was trying to kill him. yes, Saint Joseph provided for him, made sure he had food and shelter. But he did more than that. He did all of the ministries that are appropriate to a father, including teaching him carpentry and teaching him the heritage of Israel. I think this often gets forgotten, but in Jewish practice, the religious instruction of the boy is primarily the responsibility of the father, if I am not mistaken.
Yeah.
So odds are it would have been Joseph who taught Jesus to read the scriptures. Um, so I mean, what a profound mystery that the one who gave the scriptures to Israel is being taught to read them by an Israelite man. That the gift he gave to the chosen people, he's now receiving back. Uh, I mean, in a certain sense, it's almost like a prelude to the Eucharist, where we give back to God the greatest gift He's given us. Um, and others, I think there's a certain harmony there, which is, I would say, a higher standard of fittingness. It
Yeah.
resonates with the pattern of the great biblical mysteries.
Go ahead.
Well, not because what I ultimately build up to in the article is, uh, going back to St. Thomas argues from fittingness. Well, I think we need better criteria for that mode of argument. So first I made the distinction between explanatory and probative. But then I say, well, if it's probative, what's the standard that's being invoked? And um, I come up with three types that I think are of differing orders of weight. Um, in the middle, sort of the middle term would be when someone's appealing explicitly and consciously to a philosophical framework. And that's where, in St. Thomas's angelology, he relies heavily on the Dionysian corpus, and the Dionysian corpus in its teaching on the angels is very strongly based on Neoplatonism and the Neoplatonic theory of emanations. Well, then I would say when an appeal to fittingness is based on a philosophical model, the strength or weakness of that appeal
Yeah.
is the strength or weakness of the philosophical model. Now, lower than that, so a weaker argument, and this is where I put his argument, St. Thomas's argument about Christ's human teachers, when he just says, well, it is not fitting that the teacher be taught, the teacher teaches, where he doesn't name his source. Well, when there's an argument from fittingness and its source or standard isn't being explicitly named, then that would seem to imply there's something that's being taken for granted as obvious, which I think is always a kind of dangerous judgment because when things seem obvious to us, uh, well, that might be that something is actually logically self-evident, but it might be things seem obvious because of our cultural conditioning. And in fact, in a footnote in the article, I refer to one of your earlier interviews on this podcast with
That's right.
David Huston,
David Augustine.
where he had to spend one summer doing research, I believe, for Matthew Levering, researching early 20th century Thomistic manuals. And he didn't name the manual, but he said that there was one manual he read on Mariology, which said that because Our Lady um, must be the most beautiful of one among women, therefore she must have had blue eyes.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, again, that's something which might seem culturally obvious to somebody from a certain cultural setting and of a certain ethnic background at a certain time that might seem very obvious to the person when they wrote it, but we look at it and it's at best kind of amusing. So I mean, I think it's very important that when there are arguments for fittingness that aren't appealing explicitly to their criteria, that certain alarm bells go off. Because then I also allude to, I mean, when you look at the history of the church, there have been a lot of times things have been done because they seem to make sense, and now
Yeah.
we regret. Um, I point to the fact that now this is a big, complex historical issue, and it varies widely from country to country. But when you look at the history of Catholic countries in Europe having colonies outside Europe, uh, for a very long time, the colonial structure of the civil government was reflected in the governance of the church. So, for instance, in a lot of Latin America, quite often, the bishops would always be Spaniards brought from Spain, never uh, priests who were born in that country. I mean, and that pattern lasted, depending what country you're talking about, well into the end of the 19th or the early 20th century. Which there, I'm going to say that's not just funny, that's problematic.
Yeah,
So I think that appeals to conveniencia when they're not explicitly grounded, um, I think we need to really go through them with a fine-tooth comb. And that's where I also argue that when you look at the split between concilium and communio, okay, and you look at all of the great theologians who were associated with concilium, like Rahner, Schillebeeckx, and Kung, and their intellectual descendants. Um, and again, I don't claim to have expertise in any of these authors, but you don't see them explicitly framing their arguments as appeals to fittingness or convenientia. But what you do very often find is a kind of implicit understanding that uh, the contemporary world and its thought forms and its culture are owed a certain loyalty.
that's right.
Uh, because of that, because of that, there are certain things that we just can't say or do anymore because it would be pre-modern.
R-
Um, and I
Yeah,
said,
it
well,
reminds
that, that basically is an argument from conveniencia.
yeah, it reminds me of the late great Italian philosopher Augusto da Noce, where he says the central dogma of the modern world can be encapsulated in a phrase that begins, "We can no longer believe the following." And what it turns out is what it simply means is the ethos of modernity makes it difficult to believe in X, Y, and Z, and therefore we're not going to believe in X, Y, and Z anymore. So yeah, it's an argument from fittingness that really doesn't have legs.
Right. I mean, probably the most egregious example of that would be, I believe it was Bultmann's famous declaration that it's impossible for anyone who knows how to turn an electronic light on to believe in miracles.
Yeah,
Which, I mean, that's presented as a serious claim, and it holds no water. And the reason I point this out is, uh, I think that when you look at the entire disagreement at the level of fundamentals that could be typified by the split between communio and concilium, the approach of, that could be epitomized by the concilium thinkers, I think is tapping into something which is actually present in the tradition in St. Thomas. Now, is it the major thing St. Thomas does? No, it's kind of a sidebar and a relatively minor sidebar, but I think it's really there. Now, do I think it's a faithful application of St. Thomas's mode of thought? No, not at all. I don't think it's in any way a faithful application of St. Thomas's thought. But I think that it is a kind of weak spot that does need to be addressed.
yeah,
Um, whereas I think the strongest argument from fittingness, and here's where I think the article you cite by John Batts and his magnificent book, Christ the Logos, would be a great example of this.
yes,
Um, the highest argument from convenience or fittingness would be a certain kind of harmony with the other mysteries of divine revelation. So when you look at the great pattern of biblical revelation, uh, does something fit the harmonics of that pattern? As opposed to, again, when you look at the great biblical narrative, uh, it seems like throughout Scripture, God seems to delight in taking normal human expectations in terms of the normal way human beings do things and pulling the rug out from under them and surprising people. Um, I mean, just look at the whole of Genesis and Exodus, and it's sort of one repeated series of
the second born.
yes, of God subverting human expectations, right? In other words, nothing in the biblical story is the way we would have done it, and praise God for that. Um, so I think that that's a permanent warning against a kind of unreflective, oh, this makes sense. Because usually when something just seems to make sense to us in a way that we haven't thought through and critiqued, I think we're kind of setting ourselves up to have the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob pull the rug out from under us. Because that
Yeah.
seems to be what he delights to do. And of course, I mean, the incarnation and the passion of the Lord are the supreme example of that. I mean, that's certainly not how we would have done it.
And
All the more wonderful.
we haven't even begun to plumb the depths of of the notion of kenosis and the descent of God into human nature and the full kenotic elements of that, what that represents. I'm going to end with one last point here about conveniency and fittingness. It strikes me, along these lines, and talking about Platonism once again, that lurking in the background here in this question of what was the nature of Jesus's learning when he learned things? Was he genuinely learning things that he genuinely didn't know, or is it always a form of simple anamnesis, where he would be taught something that's like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, I already knew that. You sort of get this in Ronner's approach, where he talks about, well, Jesus has the knowledge of everything unthematically, but when he learns, it's getting thematized. Now, Ronner doesn't quite mean it in the sense of anamnesis, but there is, I think, lurking in the background. Well, Jesus didn't really have to learn anything new. He already knew it, but maybe it was just sort of submerged and had to be teased out.
Yes, I think it would be I think it would be good for if there's any PhD candidates out there who haven't settled on the subject of their doctoral dissertation to research precisely the way Plato's theory of anamnesis shows up in some of the patristic thinkers. I think that would be worth a really
Yeah,
in-depth study. Um, I think it all goes back to when you say Jesus learned, and if you say Jesus knew, you always have to put the brakes on and say learned how, knew
yes.
how. Um, because I mean, going back to Ronner, although I mean, I'm very much not an expert on Ronner, but um, when Ronner makes his distinction between thematic and unthematic knowledge, well, I mean, I think that's true as far as it goes.
Yeah, it
Um,
has a certain value.
but I don't think it would be helpful to use that as the model for the relationship between Christ's divine knowledge and his human knowledge.
I
Um,
agree.
like I don't think you could apply that distinction between the thematic and the unthematic to God's omniscient knowledge. So the knowledge Jesus has through his divine nature is omniscient and total. The knowledge he has as a human being, if we're going to accept the three Thomistic categories, so just leaving out of discussion for the moment the question of the beatific vision and the question of charismatic or infused knowledge and simply looking at his acquired human knowledge, uh, that knowledge by itself cannot be infinite and is therefore capable of growth, so that when he learns, he is genuinely learning. Now, I think the analogy, and again, like any analogy used to discuss the Lord, it's ultimately going to fail, and the dissimilarity will be greater than the similarity. So I give this analogy in full awareness that it doesn't exactly serve. But I think if you've lived long enough, you've had the experience multiple times of learning something new, and the information was genuinely new, and you're surprised or astonished or disturbed by it, and yet at the same time, something in the back of your mind clicks. Like on another level, you knew that, like there was something
Yeah, yeah,
you were waiting for. In other words, I think even mere human beings can experience simultaneously being ignorant and aware at different levels of our awareness.
And I think that's what Ronner means. And that's why I said it's not strictly, he's not appealing to anamnesis.
Right. Um, Whereas I think now, well, if I think that could be provide an analogy for how Jesus, i- during his earthly wayfaring, simultaneously is omniscient and experiences nescience and learns things. Now, the
Yeah.
analogy isn't exact because God's omniscience is not comparable to the sneaking suspicion I had of something that I couldn't verbalize. So, I mean, those aren't the same thing at all, but I think it's the best analogy we've got.
Yeah.
So I think it's the one we have to use as long as we're very clear that it's an analogy that ultimately fails.
I agree. I agree. Well, we've been at this now about an hour and oh geez, almost an hour and 20 minutes. So we should probably wrap this up. Is there anything that we haven't discussed, any question I haven't asked that you'd like to address, something we missed in your article that you'd like to bring up before we end this?
Well, you'd mentioned the section where I go on a discursus about what St. Thomas says about the question of angelic knowledge.
Right.
Uh, I do that because it's the other big section of the Summa that I'm aware of where he makes a claim not addressed in divine revelation about the question of knowledge, and the argument rests on convenientia. So when he asks, "Do the angels ever teach one another?" Um, Now, of course, he has a broader question: Can a creature ever teach another creature? And I think his answer to that is really very profound and fascinating. Um, he says, in the absolute sense, no. And anybody who's been a teacher long enough knows this. I can't make anybody else understand something, right? I mean, been a teacher long enough, you've all had that experience of, I wish I could
That's
make
right.
them understand, and I can't, right?
Yeah.
Only God can do that. Uh, but he poses an analogy where he says, well, does a doctor heal? Well, in the absolute sense, no. What a doctor does is a doctor taps into the natural principles that are at work in the human body and the natural principles that are at work in, other natural beings such as plants or naturally occurring medicines, and basically uses them to stimulate the natural processes of healing at work in the person so that the doctor can be said to heal, but in an analogous sense. That the way a doctor heals is not the same way God heals, and is not the same way the natural vitality of a person heals, but it's still genuine and real. That the doctor serves the process of healing. Well, in a similar way, a human teacher serves the active intellect of the person in coming to knowledge, so that a teacher can be said to teach, but in an analogous sense. Well, he then poses, do angels ever teach each other? And Thomas says yes, but only in a strictly hierarchical fashion. In other words, it only flows downwards. The higher orders teach the lower orders. The lower orders do not teach the higher orders. Now, it's strictly hierarchical.
Hence the screw tape letters.
Yes. Yes. Um, And here, his criterion is he says this on the authority of uh, Dionysius the Areopagite, that is Pseudo Dionysius. So therefore, based on the argument from authority, but of course, the Dionysian corpus, everything it says on this is very largely dependent on the Neoplatonic emanations. Okay. And therefore, the tendency you find in Greek philosophy to have a kind of aversion towards multiplicity. Um, well, I look at all of the scriptural scenes where, I mean, most of the scriptural scenes with angels are speaking to human beings. We're not given many glimpses into the interangelic world. Uh, but the handful of times we are, like in some of the visions of Daniel, a handful of the visions in the book of Revelation where we see an angel speak to another angel. Uh, well, if you wanted to say that those passages substantiate the claim that it's only the higher orders teaching the lower orders, I argue those passages don't substantiate that. Um, Either they don't address the question at all, or in some cases might undermine it. So, you
Yeah,
know, one of the visions in Revelation where the angel who is the harvester, who is seated like a royal figure and wearing a crown, is told by another angel to begin the harvest. And we're not told anything about the status of the one who conveys the message, but they seem to be lesser. Um, well, that would seem to undermine the notion that it's only downwards. And the whole reason I do that exploration is it's the other great time Thomas considers uh, teaching among creatures using an argument from convenientia.
convenience. Yeah,
Um, and I argue that here, again, when you're addressing a question whose answer isn't given in divine revelation, and you're giving a very definitive answer based largely on a philosophical model, I'm not sure that that is really a strong position. So that's the whole reason that
yeah.
section.
No, I agree, and it's a fascinating. It's a couple pages, but it's a fascinating section in the article. So anyway, I encourage everybody to read the article in the latest issue of Communio, thematized on the question of education, summer 2025. This has been an absolutely stellar and fascinating conversation, at least from my point of view. I hope you enjoyed it too.
I did. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
And well, it's an honor to have you here. And, keep those articles churning out because this one is really good. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
And thanks everyone for listening. Bye now.